Hello and welcome, friend. Tonight we'll step back into the candlelit world of medieval castles, places of stone and echoing halls, where life was very different from what we know today. If this brings you peace, consider subscribing. It helps me keep making these long, gentle stories for you. Before we begin, take a moment to dim the lights around you, to settle down into a comfortable position, and take a slow, deep breath. Let your shoulders soften as we drift into the past together. Imagine walking up to a towering fortress, its stone walls rough and gray against the sky. At first glance, you might think of castles as magnificent, majestic, maybe even romantic. But tonight, we're not here for battles or knights in shining armor. We're here for the small, quiet details, the ones that give life to the stones. And yes, that includes what these castles smelled like from the inside. Because no matter how grand the architecture, castles were still filled with people, animals, fires, food, and all the things that make life messy and very human. To us now, it might sound a little less like majesty and a little more like medieval reality as you step through the gate. The first smell that greets you is smoke. Fires burned almost constantly inside the walls. Great halls had enormous hearths that ate up logs day after day, leaving behind the familiar mix of wood smoke and ash. But unlike the cozy scent of a campfire that we might imagine now, this smoke wasn't always charming. The draft systems weren't perfect, and smoke often lingered in the rafters or seeped into the walls. Guests would sit in their finery with eyes watering gently, trying not to cough during a feast. It was a smell woven into the very fabric of castle life. And then there was the scent of food, which could be both inviting and at times questionable. Picture a kitchen where whole sides of meat roast on spits, fat dripping into the flames, filling the air with richness. Spices, if the household could afford them, gave the air a sharp sweetness: cinnamon, cloves, and pepper. But not all meals were fragrant in a pleasant way. Imagine thick stews of salted fish or cabbage boiled for hours. Imagine bread that was heavy, sometimes hard enough to be used as a plate, then eaten afterward. The smells of food weren't separated from the living quarters. They mingled with everything else, hanging in corridors, traveling under doors. But perhaps most unforgettable to a modern visitor would be the smell of humanity. Castles were crowded places. Servants, soldiers, cooks, nobles, and guests moved through the same narrow passages. Washing was not as frequent as we'd expect today, and perfumes were expensive. The smell of sweat, leather, damp wool, and unwashed bodies was as much a part of daily life as the clank of armor. Horses and livestock often lived within the walls, too, so add the earthy scent of hay and manure to the mix. It's not exactly the fairy tale fragrance one might dream of, but it was home to them. Even the stones themselves carried a smell. Damp walls absorbed the chill of rain and mist. Basements and dungeons smelled of cold water, mold, and the faint metallic tang of rusting chains. In summer, warmth baked into the stone and released a dusty mineral scent. Each season left its mark on the castle's air, making the smells shift and change with the year. If you were a visitor, you might find the scents overwhelming at first. But to those who lived there, they blended into the background, the normal perfume of daily life. Children running through the courtyards wouldn't stop to notice the smoke or the sweat. To them, the castle simply smelled like home. What's funny is how much of this might remind us of everyday things today. Think of the way your kitchen smells after cooking a big meal, or how an old stone cellar has that cool, earthy scent. Multiply that by 100 people, a few dozen horses, and the occasional sheep, and you're halfway to understanding the air of a medieval fortress. It wasn't all unpleasant either. Imagine a cold winter morning when you walk into the great hall, and the fire is roaring, bread is baking, and a jug of mulled wine steams gently on the table. There's warmth, comfort, and even coziness hidden in the smoky haze. Sometimes, those very smells were tied to memory and ritual. Chronicles mention nobles remembering the scent of certain halls, the comfort of particular kitchens, or even the sour air of places they disliked. Smell is memory, after all, and for medieval people it was no different. And yet, beyond the kitchens and the halls, there were hidden pockets of smell that tell us even more about how they lived. Imagine climbing the winding stair to the upper chambers. There, the smell is different. Rushes laid on the floor give off a grassy, herbal scent, sometimes sprinkled with dried flowers or herbs to freshen the air. This was their version of air freshener, though it lasted only so long before the rushes went musty and had to be replaced. Guests might comment politely about the lavender scattered in the chambers, but the truth is that under it lingered the less charming odors of chamber pots, tucked behind curtains. Yes, sanitation was creative. Waste had to go somewhere, and castle latrines were often simple stone seats built into the walls, dropping waste down into cesspits below. The smell? Predictable. Some were clever enough to direct waste toward running water, but not all castles had that luxury. Imagine sitting at night, candle flickering, trying not to dwell too much on what drifted up from beneath your chamber. Yet, despite all this, people didn't complain as we might expect. They were used to it, just as city folk today grow used to the smell of exhaust or the tang of subway rails. Castle dwellers thought little of it. In fact, many would have found the blend of smoke, herbs, and hearth fire comforting. It meant warmth, community, and protection inside those thick walls. So as you picture it now, imagine walking slowly through a medieval castle. Each turn of the corridor brings a different mix of scents. Roasted meat, damp stone, rushes, and maybe even the faint sweetness of honeyed mead. It is a place alive with the smells of survival, of celebration, of everyday life. And with each breath, you are reminded that history wasn't just stone and silence, but a living, breathing world. But what about when the day ended and the fires dimmed? What happened when the lights went out and the castle slipped into night? That's what we'll explore in the next part. As the day wound down within those stone walls, the castle began to shift its rhythm. The noise of hammers in the smithy, the clatter of wooden buckets at the well, and the bustling chatter of cooks and servants gradually softened. Fires burned lower, shadows stretched long across the halls, and torches were lit along stairways and corridors. Night in a medieval castle wasn't silent, but it was a different kind of sound, a muffled echo where every footstep carried further and every whisper felt heavier. And with night came new smells, new fears, and new rituals that tell us so much about how people lived. Imagine the great hall after a feast. The long trestle tables are still crowded with the remains of food. Half-eaten trenchers of bread, the bones of roasted birds, drippings of gravy hardened along wooden platters. Dogs, allowed inside to scavenge, nose through scraps, licking plates clean in their own efficient way. Servants, weary from a long day, sweep rushes together with the debris of the meal, pushing it toward the corners, where it will sit until the next cleaning. The smell here is thick. Grease cooling on platters, wine spilled into the rushes, and the faint sourness of ale left overnight in mugs. It isn't unpleasant exactly, but it is heavy, the kind of air that clings to your clothes. Up above, the nobles might withdraw to their private chambers. Curtains are drawn around beds stuffed with straw or feathers, and candles are snuffed one by one. The smell in these rooms is softer, more intimate. Beeswax candles leave behind a faint honeyed scent as they die out. Herbs placed in rushes release their aroma as feet tread over them. Chamomile, mint, and lavender were common choices, both to freshen the air and, they hoped, to ward off illness. Imagine falling asleep with that mix of herbs, smoke, and wool blankets, listening to the crackle of a dying fire. There's something cozy here, something that even we might find comforting after all. But the castle at night was also practical. Security mattered. Gates were bolted, drawbridges raised if the castle had one, and sentries posted along the walls. The smell outside was different altogether. The sharp chill of night air, the faint scent of horses in the stables, and the ever-present smell of smoke drifting from chimneys. Guards wrapped themselves in cloaks, stamping their feet to keep warm, listening for any sound out of place. Inside, the thick walls made the air still, holding on to the day's heat and odors, leaving a heavy atmosphere that could be hard to escape. For servants, the work didn't end with nightfall. Some would remain awake, tending fires so they did not die out completely. Others would prepare for the next morning, kneading dough to rise overnight or fetching water to store in barrels. Imagine a servant walking alone through a dark corridor, a single candle lighting the way, shadows dancing wildly along the damp walls. The air is cool, and each sound seems amplified. A rat scurries in the rushes, the faint drip of water echoes somewhere distant, and the smell of damp stone mixes with the waxy smoke of the candle. Of course, there was also the matter of where everyone slept. A castle might house dozens or even hundreds of people, but there were not hundreds of private rooms. Servants often slept on benches in the hall or rolled up in corners with only a thin blanket. Soldiers might sleep in barracks-like chambers, the smell of leather boots, sweat, and damp wool cloaks heavy in the air. For them, nighttime wasn't just about rest. It was about surviving the cold, the damp, and the cramped quarters. There was also an awareness that nighttime was dangerous in ways beyond intruders. Fire was always a threat. With so much wood, fabric, and thatched roofing, one stray ember could be disastrous. That's why a castle had routines for extinguishing or covering fires safely. Imagine the soft hiss of embers being damped down, the faint smell of smoke turning sharper as water or sand is thrown over the coals. This smell, harsh but necessary, was part of their nightly ritual, their way of ensuring safety. And then there were the sounds and smells of prayer. In many castles, chapels were built into the walls. At night, monks or chaplains might chant softly, their words echoing against stone, candles flickering in the cool air. The scent of incense might drift through the chapel, a heady, spicy aroma very different from the kitchens and the halls. For the religious, this was the fragrance of devotion, of sacred space set apart from the ordinary. To fall asleep after hearing those chants, with the lingering trace of frankincense in the air, must have been a strangely soothing experience. Still, for the average person, night could bring discomfort. Without modern glass, windows were often just slits or shutters, so drafts crept in. The smell of damp clothing hung near the fire to dry would fill chambers. Blankets might smell of smoke from weeks near the hearth, or of sheep's wool left only half cleaned. Yet to those who lived then, these were ordinary comforts. We might wrinkle our noses. They might have sighed with relief as they pulled the blankets close. Imagine yourself lying down on a straw mattress. You shift slightly, the straw rustling beneath you, a little scratchy, but warmer than bare stone. The scent of the straw is sweet and grassy at first, though there's also a faint mustiness. Above you, the wooden beams are dark with smoke, and through the tiny window slit, a line of moonlight stretches across the floor. Somewhere, a guard coughs. Somewhere else, a dog barks, then quiets. Slowly, the sounds soften until only the faint crackle of cooling embers remains. This was medieval sleep. Not sterile, not silent, but layered with sensations. Each smell, each sound, each flicker of light told its own story. In some ways, it's not so different from us lying down tonight, with a fan humming, or traffic murmuring in the distance, or the smell of dinner lingering in the kitchen. The details are different, but the essence of settling into rest is timeless. Comment where you're listening from tonight. I love seeing how far this sleepy little community reaches. Knowing that people all around the world are settling down to the same story adds something comforting. Like our own kind of global great hall. But what happened when night was broken by celebrations, by music, or by unexpected visitors? What did the castle feel and smell like during feasts and festivities that stretched long past midnight? That is what we'll wander into in the next part. Now let's imagine something different from the hushed nights and quiet hearths. Picture instead the castle alive with music, laughter, and feasting that stretches deep into the night. Castles were not always solemn fortresses. They were also stages for celebration, for marking the seasons, victories, and alliances. And when the feasts began, the atmosphere shifted completely. Tonight, we slip into that world, with its bright fires, crowded halls, and unforgettable smells that clung long after the last song was sung. The Great Hall was the heart of such celebrations. By day, it was the stage for justice, announcements, and meals. By night, when festivities were called, it became something closer to a medieval nightclub, if you'll forgive the comparison. Long wooden tables were hauled into place, benches lined the sides, and the hearth was stoked until flames leapt high, casting a golden glow on stone walls and tapestries. Imagine stepping into that room. The air is instantly warmer, the hum of voices so loud it vibrates in your chest. The smell of roasting meats fills the air, spiced heavily if the household could afford the luxury, mingled with the tang of ale already flowing freely. The food itself created layers of scent that blanketed the hall. Huge platters carried by servants overflowed with roasted pork, dripping fat into the rushes below. Geese basted in honey gave off a sweet, almost caramelized fragrance. Breads, freshly baked, earthy, and warm, were stacked in baskets. Cheeses, strong and pungent, released a sharp tang as they were cut. Bowls of stew steamed, spiced with herbs from the castle garden. The smell was overwhelming, but it was also intoxicating, a clear sign that this was a night of plenty, a rare chance to indulge. And not everything smelled so inviting. Fish left too long on the table, or meat roasted unevenly, gave off a less pleasant aroma that mingled with everything else. It was not refined dining by our standards, but it was abundance, and that was the point. Drinks flowed endlessly. Ale and beer were common, their yeasty smell filling mugs across the room. Wine, if available, added its own sour-sweet aroma, though medieval wine was not always the smooth kind we sip today. Spices like cinnamon or ginger were sometimes stirred in, creating a strange mix of sharp and sweet. Imagine the smell of a dozen mugs clinking, a little spilled here and there, soaking into the rushes and leaving behind a sticky sweetness that would linger for days. This was part of the feast, the messy joy of it, the sense that tonight was different from ordinary nights. And then there was the smell of people. Crowds packed into the hall meant warmth, sweat, and the sharp tongue of wool cloaks damped from the evening air. Add to that the smell of perfumes and oils worn by the nobles, often thick and musky, clashing with the more earthy scents of servants and guards. Imagine the air dense with it all: meat, ale, herbs, perfume, smoke, and humanity. It was heavy, almost suffocating, but it was alive. To those inside, it was exhilarating. A heady mix that said this was no ordinary evening yacht entertainment added its own layer. Musicians played lutes, flutes, or drums, the sounds bouncing off stone walls. Dancers leapt and spun, their movements stirring the air, the smell of their sweat mixing with the herbs strewn on the floors. Jugglers sometimes performed, and even animals, trained bears or monkeys, might be brought in, leaving behind their own unmistakable odors. And yes, laughter itself has a kind of presence. Imagine the warmth of voices raised in song, the sound so thick it feels like a smell, a vibration in the air you can almost breathe in. The smells of feasts didn't vanish when the night ended. Leftover bones tossed to dogs, spilled wine souring in the rushes, candle wax melted onto wood, smoke clinging to every tapestry. All these lingered. Servants worked through the night or the next morning to clean. But for days afterward, the great hall carried the memory of the celebration. Guests arriving later might wrinkle their noses, catching the faint whiff of old meat or spoiled ale, like echoes of laughter trapped in the air. For the people themselves, though, this wasn't unpleasant. These smells meant life, abundance, and joy. Think of how your house smells after a big family holiday meal. A little messy, a little overwhelming, but comforting because it means people gathered, stories were told, and memories were made. In the same way, the medieval castle's feast day scents were part of the memory-making process. A child growing up in the castle might always associate the smell of roast goose with joy, or the tang of spiced ale with music and dancing. And there were small details that might surprise you. For example, many feasts ended with sweetmeats, little sugary or honeyed confections. The smell of honey was strong, sharp, almost floral, cutting through the heaviness of the meats. Guests might carry these treats away, leaving sticky fingers and sweet-smelling rushes in their wake. Imagine a child sneaking one last bite, falling asleep later with the faint scent of honey clinging to their hair. Of course, feasts were not everyday events. They marked important moments, the visit of a king, a wedding, a religious holiday, or the sealing of an alliance. And because they were rare, they were memorable. To live through one was to carry its smells and sounds in your mind for months afterward, a reminder that life wasn't always toil and hunger, but sometimes overflowing tables and laughter. A medieval chronicler might record the political details of such an event, but the people remembered the sensory ones, the food, the drink, the joy. And yet, as the last guests stumbled to their chambers and the fire burned low, a different smell always crept back into the hall. The smell of ashes cooling, of spilled ale turning sour, of damp rushes that would need replacing soon. The quiet after joy always smelled different. It was like the sigh of the building itself, breathing out the night before it returned to ordinary life. In that way, the feast was not just a moment, but a memory etched into stone and smoke. And if you close your eyes tonight, you can almost step into that hall, feel the heat of the fire, hear the laughter, and smell the mix of sweetness, sharpness, and earthiness that marked the castle's moments of joy. But what about the quieter days between feasts, when life slowed back into routines, and the castle smelled not of abundance, but of ordinary survival? That is what we'll drift into in the next part. After the laughter of feasts faded, and the yarn, echoes of music dwindled into memory, the castle returned to its quieter rhythm. Most days were not filled with abundance and revelry. They were filled with ordinary tasks, small comforts, and routines that shaped the daily lives of those who lived within the walls. And in those quieter stretches, the smells of the castle became subtler, though no less telling. Tonight, we'll step into that slower pace, moving through the castle as its inhabitants did on an ordinary day. The morning began early. Imagine the first light of dawn filtering through narrow window slits, a pale shaft cutting across the stone floor. Roosters crow in the courtyards, their sound sharp and insistent, mixed with the low murmurs of servants already at work. Fires, banked overnight, are stirred back into life. The smell of smoke rises once more, faint at first, then filling halls with that familiar, constant haze. It was the smell of continuity, of every day beginning the same way, regardless of whether it promised feasting or famine. Breakfasts in castles were modest for most people. Bread, sometimes fresh but often yesterday's loaf, carried the faint sour smell of fermentation and the earthy dust of ground rye or barley. Cheese, sharp and tangy, was common, its smell growing stronger the longer it aged. Porridge was also a staple, thick and steaming, carrying the smell of oats boiled slowly with water or milk, sometimes flavored with herbs if they were available. For the wealthy, the meal might be improved with butter, honey, or even a small piece of fruit. But most mornings smelled simple: bread, cheese, and smoke. Imagine sitting on a wooden bench, cradling a bowl of warm porridge, steam rising and carrying with it the faint sweetness of the grain. The castle's rhythms were practical. Servants swept rushes, changed bedding, and fetched water. Their movement left a trail of scents across corridors: damp wool drying near fires, the grassy smell of fresh rushes gathered from riverbanks, and the unmistakable tang of human labor. These were the scents of maintenance, of trying to keep stone walls livable. To us, they might feel like reminders of hardship. To them, they were just part of keeping the castle alive, not in workshops and side chambers. Craft added its own notes to the air. The blacksmith's forge gave off the sharp, acrid smell of hot iron, smoke, and sweat. Leather workers left behind the earthy, almost animal scent of hides treated with oils. Candle makers filled rooms with waxy sweetness when fresh tallow or beeswax was poured. Each space carried its own atmosphere, distinct and layered. Imagine walking through the halls, and with each doorway you pass, the air shifts from the warmth of bread baking to the sharpness of metal cooling to the faintly sour tang of fermenting ale. The castle was not one smell, but a collage, stitched together by its people's work. Animals, too, were part of the everyday. Horses in the stables gave off the deep, warm smell of hay, sweat, and manure. Chickens scratched noisily in corners, their feathers carrying a dusty, almost musty scent. Sometimes pigs or goats were kept within the walls for convenience, and their earthy, pungent odor mingled with everything else. This was not considered unpleasant. In fact, for many, these smells were reassurance. They meant food, transport, and security. To smell the stables was to know the castle was well supplied. Daily meals were the anchor of routine. Lunch might be stew, thick and simple, simmered slowly over the hearth. The smell was heavy with cabbage, leeks, or beans, with a salty tang for preserved meat. Imagine dipping bread into the steaming mixture, the aroma rising with every bite. It wasn't glamorous, but it was filling. And that was the point. Evenings brought a similar meal, though on better days, a fresh roast might add variety. But the smells rarely left the kitchens behind. Smoke carried them upward, seeping through floorboards and doorways until the whole castle seemed infused with food, one meal blurring into the next dot. And then there was the matter of hygiene, or rather the medieval version of it. Bathing was not an everyday event. Instead, people freshened themselves with linen cloths, scented waters, or by changing undergarments. The smell of soap was rare, often faint and herbal when it appeared. Instead, bodies carried their own natural presence: sweat, wool, leather, and the faint musk of straw mattresses clung to everyone, noble or servant alike. To us, this might sound unpleasant, but in a world where everyone smelled similarly, it was hardly worth noticing. It was background noise for the nose, like the hum of traffic to us now. Even prayer shaped the daily atmosphere. Chapels held the scent of incense, beeswax, and stone worn smooth by generations of knees. The faintly smoky, spicy smell of incense wasn't limited to services. It lingered long after, embedding itself into the stone. For many, this smell was comfort itself, tied to ritual and the sense of the sacred. Imagine walking past a chapel and catching a whiff of it, even on an ordinary Tuesday, and feeling momentarily stilled. One overlooked part of daily life was the constant repair of clothing. People didn't have endless wardrobes. Garments smelled of wool, of the oils used to soften leather shoes, of smoke from countless hours spent near the hearth. And repairs carried their own scent: the beeswax rubbed on thread, the faint metallic tongue of needles, the grassy smell of new linen. These were subtle notes, but they lingered in corners, in baskets of mending by the fire. The castle's air was not static. It shifted with weather. Rain brought a damp, earthy smell, as stone absorbed moisture and rushes grew musty. Sunlight warmed walls, releasing the dry mineral scent of rock and mortar. Winter meant sharper smells, wood smoke heavy in the air, animal barns more pungent, bodies huddled closer together. Each season wrote itself into the air of the castle, making its presence known. And beyond all the practical details, there was the human side. Imagine the smell of ink and parchment in a scribe's chamber, sharp and almost metallic from the iron galling, or the faint sweetness of honey cakes made on rare occasions in the kitchens, or the tang of leather gloves freshly oiled before a journey. These were the details that made the castle feel less like stone and more like life. Small, almost invisible, but together they built a sensory world as real as the walls themselves. Daily life might sound repetitive, but within its routines was stability. The people of the castle breathed in these scents day after day, and with them came reassurance. Bread would be baked, fires would be lit, animals would be fed, prayers would be said. It was the medieval version of comfort, the background rhythm that gave shape to every life inside the walls. But what about the more mysterious parts of the castle, the hidden places that most people never saw? What did they smell like in the stillness? In the next part, we'll descend into dungeons and storerooms, where the air carried secrets of its own. Now we step downward, leaving the warmth of hearths and the chatter of daily routines behind. Beneath the castle, in its lower reaches, lay chambers that most people rarely visited. Storerooms, cellars, dungeons, places where the air grew heavy and smells told stories that words could not. If the upper halls of the castle smelled like survival and life, the underground spaces smelled like memory, mystery, and sometimes dread. Let's walk there together, slowly, as though carrying a flickering torch. A stairwell downward is narrow, the stone damp beneath your hand as you descend. Already, the air changes. Gone is the smoky warmth of the great hall. Instead, there's a chill that clings to your skin, a dampness that smells of earth and stone. Every breath feels heavier. You can almost taste the minerals in the air. Imagine the silence, too, broken only by the echo of your own footsteps. It's as though the castle itself exhales differently here. The first rooms you might encounter would be storerooms. These were practical spaces built to preserve food and supplies. The smell here is layered. Sacks of grain give off a dry, dusty aroma, like old straw left too long in the sun. Barrels of salted fish fill the room with a briny tongue, sharp and overwhelming at first, but soon blending into the background. Dried herbs hang from beams, their fragrance faint but distinct. Thyme, rosemary, maybe sage, each giving a tiny spark of freshness in the gloom. Then there is the faint sourness of old ale, barrels tapped and drained long ago, but still carrying their yeasty ghost in the wood. Imagine standing there, torchlight flickering, breathing in that mix. Sharp salt, dusty grain, faint herbs, and the heavy weight of damp stone. Deeper still, some castles stored wine in cellars. Here, the smell is richer, sweeter, and mustier. Wine barrels, stacked in rows, gave off the scent of fermentation, sour yet promising, a little like crushed fruit left to rest. The wood of the casks had absorbed decades of spills, carrying their own aroma of tannins and oak. Imagine a noble coming down with a servant to sample a cask, the flicker of the torch casting shadows over arched ceilings, and the air filled with that intoxicating musty sweetness. Even centuries later, old wine cellars smell much the same. But not all underground chambers carried comfort. Dungeons, when they existed, had their own atmosphere altogether. The air was colder still, heavy with the smell of rusting chains and stagnant water. The damp walls grew mold, adding a sour fungal scent that clung to clothes and skin. Human presence added more layers. The smell of sweat, fear, unwashed bodies, and straw laid on stone floors for bedding. Imagine a torch sputtering, its smoke mixing with those smells, leaving behind an acrid, choking haze. For prisoners, this was the world they breathed every moment. The dread of dungeons wasn't only about sight or sound. It was olfactory, too. The smell of suffering was part of the architecture, part of the memory of those who entered. Guards who worked there may have grown used to it, but visitors often remarked on the stench. Chroniclers described foul airs rising from such spaces, proof that even in their time, these odors were strong enough to be recorded in words. Beyond the dungeons, some castles had secret chambers or passages. Their smells were subtler, but just as distinctive. Imagine narrow stone tunnels, little used, where the air smells stale, as if trapped for centuries. Dust hangs in the air, dry and chalky, coating every surface. Sometimes a draft carried hints of other places, the faint sweetness of a chapel, the tang of a stable, the dampness of the moat outside. Each whiff told a secret, proof that the walls themselves breathed, however faintly. The underground was also home to storage for less glamorous needs. Tallow for candles, greasy and pungent, was kept in bulk. Imagine walking past jars of it, the smell thick, almost suffocating, a little like rancid butter. Weapons, too, were stored below, their iron carrying a metallic tongue that lingered on the tongue. Oil used to preserve them, added a faint sharpness to the air. These weren't smells meant to be pleasant. They were smells of necessity, the backstage world that kept the castle running. And sometimes, the smells hinted at history, older than the castle itself. Many were built on foundations of earlier structures. Roman forts, Saxon halls, even ancient settlements. Dig deep enough, and the earth carried traces of fires long gone, of soil turned by hands centuries before. You might catch a whiff of that ancient damp, the smell of time itself pressing close. It's strange to think that the air in such chambers may have held molecules of smoke from fires, burned 1,000 years earlier. Imagine pausing in one of these underground chambers. You hold the torch steady. The flame crackles softly, its smoke sharp against your nose. The air is cold, damp, smelling of stone and silence. Your breath comes out in a faint mist, mixing with the scents around you. Somewhere, water drips, echoing endlessly. It is a place where the senses sharpen, where smell and sound guide you more than sight. For those who lived in the castle, these smells were reminders of both survival and danger. The storerooms smelled of plenty, reassurance that food was safe. The dungeons smelled of fear, a warning of punishment. The secret passages smelled of dust and secrecy, whispers carried in stale air. Each part of the underground had its role, and its smells told that story without words to us. These spaces might seem eerie, almost unbearable, but to medieval dwellers, they were practical parts of life. The smell of salted fish meant winter survival. The smell of tallow meant light in the darkness. Even the musty smell of dungeons meant security, a reminder that enemies or lawbreakers could be contained. Just as kitchens and great halls carried the perfume of life, the underground carried the scent of necessity. So when we think of castles today, with their grandeur and their towering walls, it's worth remembering that much of their character was written underground, in spaces most visitors never saw. And those spaces had voices of their own, quiet, heavy, and unforgettable. But what happened when sickness crept inside the walls? What did a castle smell like when illness spread, when the air itself seemed dangerous to breathe? That is what we'll explore in the next part. When we think of castles, we often imagine armor gleaming in sunlight or fires roaring in great halls. But life within those stone walls also carried shadows. the shadows of sickness, of fevers that swept through chambers, and of remedies that could not always keep pace. Tonight, we'll wander through that side of castle life, guided less by sight than by smell, because illness always had a scent of its own. Imagine waking in a chamber where the air is thick, heavy not with the fragrance of food or herbs, but with the unmistakable smell of sickness. A person lies feverish under blankets, their body unwashed, sweat soaking the straw mattress beneath. The smell of damp straw is sour, mixed with the sharp tang of illness, a scent that seems to cling to the nostrils. Others in the room shift uneasily, breathing the same air, knowing that sickness lingers not just in the body, but in the atmosphere itself. In medieval times, many believed disease spread through bad air, the so-called miasma. And in a way, their noses were not wrong. Infection was invisible, but it felt present, and smell was its messenger. The castle's healers, whether monks, herbalists, or sometimes women skilled in remedies, did what they could to change that air. Herbs were burned, releasing sharp, cleansing fragrances. Rosemary, sage, and thyme were common, their strong aromas thought to purify. Imagine the acrid smoke of burning rosemary filling a sick room, half comforting, half choking. Sometimes vinegar was sprinkled on rushes or sponges, its sour smell believed to cut through corruption. The scent of vinegar lingered, sharp and biting, a constant companion in rooms where the ill were tended. Medicinal concoctions themselves carried powerful smells. Garlic was used liberally, its pungent aroma strong enough to overwhelm other scents. Onions, too, were thought to draw out illness. Honey, thick and sweet, was mixed into remedies, leaving a cloying fragrance when smeared on wounds or dissolved in drinks. Imagine a room where garlic and honey mingle with the sourness of sweat, a strange mixture, but one tied to hope for healing. The presence of death, however, was harder to disguise. When sickness overwhelmed, the smell of decay crept in. Even in castles, with their stone walls and lofty ceilings, the scent of a dying body was unmistakable. Chroniclers of the time did not shy away from noting it. Death smelled of stillness, of breath gone stale, of bodies not washed or changed quickly enough. And when plague struck, the Black Death or lesser outbreaks, the entire castle could feel wrapped in that suffocating air, every chamber carrying whispers of it. But not all smells of illness were grim. Some remedies offered moments of comfort. Mint leaves crushed into poultices gave off their cool, sharp scent. Chamomile brewed into tea released a floral calm. Lavender, prized when available, was laid under pillows or burned, its fragrance softening the heaviness of the room. For those tending the sick, these smells were as much a comfort to themselves as to the patient. Imagine leaning close to a sickbed and catching the sweet relief of lavender amid the sour air, like a breath of fresh hope. Bathing, though not common, was sometimes used as a cure. Hot baths infused with herbs released clouds of steam that smelled of pine, juniper, or rosemary. The steam clung to the skin, filling rooms with warmth and greenery. Even if it did little to cure the illness, it soothed, and the smells themselves were part of the ritual of care. When sickness spread widely, the whole castle shifted. The smell of burning herbs might drift through every hall. Candles and incense burned almost constantly in chapels, their spicy smoke rising in prayers for healing. The scent of beeswax became tied to desperation, the smell of faith when medicine was powerless. Imagine a chapel lit with dozens of candles, the air thick with smoke and prayer, each breath reminding you of both devotion and fear. Waste, too, became part of sickness. Buckets of vomit and other bodily fluids had to be carried away, their smells unavoidable, their presence a reminder of human fragility. Servants tasked with this must have grown used to it, but the odors of sickness and waste became part of the castle's landscape during outbreaks. Even with rushes replaced and herbs scattered, The memory of it lingered in stone. Children and the elderly were especially vulnerable, and their absence left behind its own emptiness. An absence you could almost smell in the suddenly quieter chambers. Some rooms, once filled with life and laughter, were marked by the faint smell of herbs burned in vain attempts to protect them. History holds countless such moments, even if words rarely linger on them. The stones absorbed it all, and yet resilience lived there too. The castle's people survived by finding comfort where they could. The smell of bread baking in kitchens could still drift into the sick rooms, reminding patients and caregivers alike that life continued outside those walls. Horses still needed feeding, fires still needed tending, meals still needed cooking. The normal smells of daily life persisted, a counterbalance to the heaviness of illness. When health returned, even partially, the air shifted. Sweat-soaked mattresses were taken outside to be beaten and aired. Windows, if the weather allowed, were flung open to let in the fresh scent of rain or pine from nearby forests. Herbs were laid fresh on floors, and fires rekindled with new logs. The smell of clean wood smoke driving away the memory of sickness. The castle seemed to breathe again, filling its lungs with fresher air. For us now, it may be hard to imagine living with such constant closeness to illness. We are used to sterility, to hospitals smelling of antiseptic and bleach. But for them, smells themselves were medicine. To change the air was to change the fate of the body. Every herb burned, every flower scattered, every candle lit was as much about changing what people smelled as about curing their sickness. They believed in the healing power of fragrance long before modern science could explain the connection between scent, memory, and mood. So, sickness gave castles their own shadowed smells, sharp, sour, herbal, smoky, not glamorous, but profoundly human. They remind us that even behind walls of stone, illness was a companion, always present, always shaping the way people lived, prayed, and remembered. But what about the other great human equalizer? Love, marriage, and family. What did a castle smell like during weddings, during the marking of unions, and the rituals of domestic life? That's what we'll step into in the next part. If sickness gave castles their shadows, then weddings and family life gave them their warmth. Tonight, we'll wander into those softer moments, when the halls rang not with dread, but with joy, when people gathered to celebrate union, continuity, and kinship. To step into a medieval castle during a wedding or family ritual was to step into a world where smell carried both festivity and intimacy, layering memories onto the very stones themselves. Imagine a wedding day. The great hall, so often filled with the ordinary sense of smoke and bread, was transformed into a place of pageantry. Fresh rushes were laid on the floor, scattered with herbs and flowers to perfume the air. Rosemary was especially favored, its sharp, resinous scent thought to symbolize fidelity. Roses and violets might be woven into garlands, their delicate fragrances softening the heaviness of the hall. Imagine walking through, the stone warmed by firelight, while the mingling smells of flowers and herbs gave the impression that spring itself had stepped indoors. The food of such occasions was even richer than a feast. Roasted swans, peacocks served with feathers reattached for display, great pies filled with venison or boar. Each dish gave off its own distinctive smell. The air was thick with the richness of meat, spiced with cloves, nutmeg, or cinnamon if the household had the wealth to procure them. Imagine the shock of those spices in the air, exotic and strange to many guests, like a whisper from lands they would never see. To smell cinnamon in a cold stone, castle was to be reminded of distant markets in Alexandria or Venice. Sweet dishes, too, were part of the ritual. Honey cakes, gingerbread, and almond confections carried their own fragrances, cloying and sweet. These smells would have lingered long after the celebration, carried on hands sticky with sugar. on breath after bites of candied fruit. For children present, those smells might become forever linked with joy, the memory of watching their elders dance while sneaking. Another piece of gingerbread. Drinks carried the festivities further. Spiced wine, warmed and infused with herbs, gave off a fragrance both sharp and soothing, filling the air with sweetness and tang. Mead, honey-based and heady, gave off its own floral aroma. Ale, always present, added its yeasty scent to the mix. Together, the drinks created an olfactory chorus, so strong that even the walls seemed to hum with it. And yet, the human presence was just as important. Weddings were crowded affairs. The press of bodies created warmth, and with it, the inevitable mingling of perfumes, sweat, damp cloaks, and wool. Nobles wore oils and perfumes, heavy and musky, often overpowering in closed spaces. Servants, less adorned, brought the earthier smells of labor. Imagine the mix of musk, flowers, honey, spices, and smoke. Overwhelming, chaotic, but alive. Marriage rituals themselves carried scent as part of their meaning. Some ceremonies used incense, filling chapels with heady, resinous smoke. Frankincense or myrrh, when available, turned the small space into something otherworldly, their smells tied to sacred vows. The scent of incense in a medieval chapel was not only religious, it was sensory theater, a reminder to everyone present that they were in a holy moment, that something larger than themselves was happening. And beyond the public celebration, there was the private side of marriage and family. Chambers decorated for newlyweds often carried fresh herbs, flowers, and perfumed linens. The smell of lavender or chamomile might be scattered across the bed. Beeswax candles gave off their sweet, warm fragrance. These scents were meant not only to please, but to protect, for many believed herbs warded off evil or sickness. Imagine lying down in such a chamber, the air heavy with herbal sweetness, the stone walls softened by candlelight. Family life brought its own smells, subtler but no less meaningful. A child's cradle might be lined with herbs for protection, their grassy fragrance always close at hand. The smell of milk, sweet and slightly sour, with lingering nurseries, mixed with the smell of wool blankets and beeswax from the candles kept close at night. For parents, those smells became the essence of comfort, the perfume of new life continuing the family line. Even simple domestic rituals had their scents. Warming a child's shoes by the fire filled the air with the smell of leather and smoke. Tending to clothes gave off the waxy tang of beeswax rubbed into thread. Meals eaten together in smaller chambers carried quieter aromas. A pot of porridge, a jug of cider, the faint smell of apples stored in baskets for winter. These were not the grand scents of feasts, but the everyday fragrances of kinship. And yet, castles were never completely private. The smells of family life always mingled with the wider world. A child's laughter might carry through the halls and mix with the sharper tang of the stables nearby. The scent of herbs scattered on a nursery floor might be overpowered by smoke drifting upward from the kitchens. Privacy was relative. Smells reminded everyone that they were part of a larger household, part of a shared existence. Still, certain scents became symbols. For instance, rosemary, with its strong and lasting fragrance, was tied not just to weddings, but to memory itself. Medieval people believed it helped remember the dead and honor the living. To scatter rosemary at a wedding was to bind love with remembrance, a fragrance that carried through time. Imagine guests leaving the hall, rosemary sprigs tucked into their belts, the smell lingering as they walked home in the night. So the smells of love and family life in castles were not just pleasant. They were symbolic, layered with meaning, connecting daily existence with sacred ritual. They turned cold stone walls into homes, binding people to one another through memory and sense. And while joy had its sense, so too did grief. Weddings celebrated union, but funerals marked loss, and castles bore both. The next time we wander deeper, we'll follow the air of mourning, of death and ritual, and discover what a castle smelled like when it said goodbye to its own. After weddings and joy came the inevitable other side of life within castle walls, mourning and funerals. If love and marriage filled the air with rosemary, roses, and honeyed wine, then death brought its own atmosphere, one far heavier and more sobering. Tonight, we'll wander quietly through that experience, moving softly, as though we too are paying our respects. When someone died within a castle, the first sign was often scent itself. The body, even within hours, began to shift the air around it. The smell of sweat turned sour, the skin faintly metallic, the straw beneath beginning to sour with damp. For families, this was the beginning of grief, and the smell was inseparable from the knowledge that life had passed. Servants hurried to wash the body with herbs and water, trying to replace the natural odor of death with fragrances of rosemary, lavender, or sage. Imagine the strong, resinous scent of rosemary being rubbed into skin, its sharpness filling the chamber, mingling with beeswax candles lit nearby. The room itself was transformed for mourning. Curtains drawn, candles burning in steady lines, rushes replaced with fresher ones scattered with herbs. The chapel-like smell of incense often filled the air, thick and resinous as prayers were spoken. For the wealthy, frankincense or myrrh was burned, their exotic fragrances thought to purify the air and protect the soul. Imagine kneeling in such a chamber, the smell of incense clinging to your hair, the heaviness of candle smoke clouding the air, and underneath it all, the faint, unavoidable truth of mortality. For the community, mourning carried ritual scents too. Black cloth hung in chambers smelled of dye, strong and pungent when freshly made. Guests arriving to pay respects brought with them the smells of travel, horses, wet wool, damp cloaks, and these layered onto the atmosphere, turning the air thick with humanity and grief. Meals provided for mourners added their own quieter aromas, simple breads and ale consumed with little appetite. Even the food carried the weight of the occasion. Funerals within castles often began in chapels. Here, the smell was sacred, but also overwhelming. Incense, beeswax candles, old stone. The air was often so heavy that it clung to clothes for hours afterward. Imagine a line of mourners, heads bowed, each candle adding to the heat, each drop of wax releasing more of its faint honey fragrance. Chanting filled the chapel, and the sound itself seemed almost to vibrate with the smell of incense, as though the senses were bound together in a single act of mourning. When bodies were carried outside, the scents changed again. Coffins or shrouds carried through courtyards took with them the fragrances of herbs and incense, but the open air added its own. The smell of damp earth waiting at the grave, the faint sweetness of flowers laid on top, the chill of morning air, or the dust of summer wind. These became the smells of farewell. Imagine standing at the edge of a grave, the smell of soil freshly turned, mixing with rosemary sprigs cast down in remembrance. That scent would linger long after the ceremony ended, clinging to gloves, cloaks, and hair. For those left behind, mourning had its own daily scents. Clothes dyed black smelled strongly, sometimes unpleasantly, of the substances used to achieve such deep color. Rooms where the deceased had lain carried a faint echo of herbs and incense, sometimes for weeks afterward. Candles burned longer, filling the halls with that steady beeswax fragrance, their smoke leaving a film on tapestries and stone. Even silence seemed to have a scent in those days, the absence of laughter or movement, leaving the air still, heavy, almost stale. Yet grief was not only about heaviness. Rituals of remembrance brought their own gentler smells. Masses said for the dead meant incense rising again, filling chapels with that familiar sacred perfume. Herbs laid on graves released their scent in the sun or rain, marking the passing of seasons. Bread baked in commemoration gave off warmth and comfort. In some castles, anniversaries of death were marked with feasts where the air once more filled with roasting meats and honeyed wines, turning sorrow into memory through shared smells of abundance. Children growing up in castles might remember grief most through these scents: the sharpness of rosemary at funerals, the heavy sweetness of incense in chapels, the smell of damp earth at gravesides. These smells became memory markers, ways to recognize mourning even years later. In that sense, scent bound families to their past as much as stone walls did. For us, modern funerals often smell of flowers, of polished wood, of faint colognes. But for medieval people, it was earthier, heavier, sharper. It was herbs rubbed into skin, incense clouding a small chapel, damp stone holding the smell of candle smoke. It was life and death written into the air, inescapable and unforgettable. And yet, even as morning hung over castles, life continued. A smell of bread still rose from kitchens. Horses still needed tending. Fire still smoked in hearths. The scent of grief was never the only scent. It always existed alongside the smells of survival. That balance is what gave medieval life its resilience. They lived with death close at hand, but also with life constantly insisting itself into the air. Imagine yourself now, standing in a medieval chapel after a funeral. The candles are still burning, their wax dripping steadily. The air is thick with incense, almost choking, but comforting in its way. Outside, you hear a dog bark, smell wood smoke drifting on the wind, and realize life has already moved on, even as grief lingers. That mixture, sorrow and survival, was the essence of castle life. And if death shaped the air of mourning, what about the air of defense, a preparation for battle? How did a castle smell when its walls were readying for attack, when weapons were sharpened and soldiers gathered? That is where we'll travel in the next part. Now we turn to a different atmosphere altogether, one less about feasts or mourning, and more about survival itself. Castles, after all, were not just homes. They were fortresses, built to withstand attacks, sieges, and long months of uncertainty. And when danger loomed, when soldiers gathered and weapons were prepared, the very air inside a castle changed. It was filled with urgency, with tension, and yes, with smells that spoke of iron, sweat, fear, and fire. Tonight, we'll walk through that tense environment, listening to the echoes of footsteps on stone and breathing in the air of a castle on guard. Imagine, the morning after a warning bell has sounded. The drawbridge is up, gates secured, guards posted along battlements. The smell outside is crisp, carrying the distant tang of smoke from enemy campfires. Inside, the air is heavier, charged with anticipation. In the great hall, tables are cleared to make space for weapons and armor. The smell of oiled steel fills the air, sharp, metallic, with a hint of the animal fat or beeswax used to keep blades from rusting. Armor, freshly polished, smells of metal and leather, the straps creaking as they are fastened. Imagine row upon row of soldiers adjusting their gear, the clink of chainmail filling the hall, and with every movement, the scent of iron rising around you. The kitchens, too, take on a different scent during times of defense. Food is salted, dried, or smoked in preparation for a long siege. The smell of smoke thickens as meats are preserved, a sharp brine of salted fish and pork filling storerooms. Bread is baked in great quantities, leaving the air heavy with yeast and flour. Imagine entering the kitchens and finding them almost suffocating with the smell of smoke and salt, so different from the warm, spiced aromas of feasts. These were not celebratory smells, but the smells of rationing, of survival, that the soldiers themselves carried their own atmosphere. Hundreds of men living close together meant the air was thick with sweat, leather, and damp wool. Boots drying by the fire released the smell of mud and horse manure. Bodies unwashed in preparation for long watches gave off their own musk, earthy and sour. It was the scent of endurance, a smell as much a part of battle as the clang of steel, and beneath it all, the faint but unmistakable odor of fear. Not the kind you see written on faces, but the kind you sense in the sweat of palms, in the nervous shifting of men waiting for orders. Fear itself has a smell, metallic and sharp, carried in the air when too many breathe it at once. Beyond the hall, the stables were central during preparations. Horses, restless and stamping, filled the air with their strong animal scent, a mix of hay, sweat, and dung. The leather of saddles and bridles added their own sharp tang, mixed with the faint sweetness of oiled wood from lances and shields. Imagine standing in a crowded stable, the air hot and pungent, thick with life and readiness. Horses snorted, soldiers murmured, and the entire space seemed to pulse with nervous energy. Up on the walls, the smell was different. Tar was often heated to be poured on attackers, its pungent, resinous scent filling the air long before it was used. Stones piled for defense carried the cold, dusty scent of freshly broken rock. Fires prepared for flaming arrows left the battlements smoky, the acrid smell drifting downward. Imagine walking along those walls at dawn, the air cold, your hands sticky from tar, your nose stung by smoke. Every breath was a reminder that the castle was alive and ready to defend itself. And then, when battle came, the smells multiplied into chaos. Arrows loosed in volleys left faint whiffs of resin and wood. The clash of steel on steel brought the hot, metallic scent of sparks and blood. Wounded men filled the air with cries, their sweat and blood adding coppery sharpness to the already heavy air. Fires lit by attackers sent smoke curling into the sky, filling lungs and blinding eyes. Imagine standing in the courtyard during an assault, breathing in smoke, sweat, and iron all at once, each smell telling you exactly how dire the moment had become. Sieges, however, had their own particular atmosphere. They were less about the sudden shock of battle and more about endurance. Inside, food spoiled slowly, and the air grew thick with the smell of rot. Water supplies, stagnant and low, gave off their own musty odor. Waste, harder to carry away, filled latrines until their stench seeped into corridors. Hunger itself had a smell. The sour emptiness of kitchens where only scraps remained. The faint mold of bread stretched too long. The bitterness of herbs boiled into weak soups. Imagine a castle 3 months into siege, the once lively kitchens now reeking of desperation, the people huddled together, breathing in the air of survival, thin and bitter. And yet, within that heaviness, there were small acts of resilience. Herbs were still burned to mask foul odors. Fires still filled rooms with wood smoke, the crackle comforting even when food was scarce. Bread, however coarse, still carried the faint sweet smell of grain, a reminder that life persisted. Even in the darkest sieges, the castle's people sought comfort in the simplest sense. For the enemy outside, the smell was different still. Camps of hundreds or thousands left their own mark. Smoke from countless fires, the stench of latrines dug hastily, the smell of horses and leather spread across fields. When the wind shifted, those odors drifted over castle walls, reminding defenders that the threat was constant, inescapable, just beyond the gates. Victory or defeat left its own aftermath. If the castle survived, the air eventually cleared, smoke dissipated, waste removed, bread baked anew. But the stone held memories. Walls blackened by fire carried the acrid smell of char long after. Courtyards where men had fallen carried the iron tang of blood for days. Even after cleaning, even after celebration, those who lived there would remember. Smell, after all, is memory's most loyal companion. So castles on guard had an atmosphere unlike any other. Sharp, heavy, acrid, metallic, pungent. sometimes suffocating, sometimes strangely comforting. It was the smell of human beings doing whatever they could to survive, behind walls of stone. But castles were not only about survival. They were also about faith, about sacred rituals woven into daily life. What did a castle smell like in its chapels, during prayers, festivals, and holy days? That is where we will wander next. Now we turn from the clang of steel and the heavy smoke of sieges to something gentler, though no less powerful in its effect on the senses, the sacred life of a medieval castle. For faith was not only a matter of belief, it was something you could hear, see, and especially smell. Chapels, prayers, festivals, and holy rituals filled the air with fragrances that lingered long after the words of prayer had faded. Tonight, let's step into that space, soft and reverent, where the air itself seemed to carry the breath of devotion. Every castle of importance had a chapel. Some were small, carved into the stone near a family's private chambers. Others were larger, almost miniature churches, serving everyone within the walls. Imagine walking through a narrow doorway into such a space. The light is dim, filtered through narrow stained glass. The air is immediately different. It is cooler, calmer, and infused with the faint perfume of incense that has seeped into the very stone over years of prayers. The smell is resinous, smoky, and strangely sweet, a blend of frankincense and myrrh when wealth allowed, or more humble resins when it did not. Beeswax candles were a constant presence. Their smell was gentle, warm, faintly sweet, and earthy. When lit in dozens, the fragrance grew stronger, mixing with smoke to create an atmosphere both comforting and overwhelming. Imagine standing in that small space, the heat of the candles raising the temperature, their scent mingling with incense until it became impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. That mixture was not merely pleasant. It was symbolic, representing prayers rising upward with the smoke. Holy water, too, had its own fragrance, often scented with herbs like rosemary or thyme, giving it a sharp, cleansing aroma. To dip your fingers into the basin was to carry a faint herbal scent on your skin, a reminder of protection and blessing. Linen altar cloths washed with lavender or chamomile gave off quiet whispers of fragrance as they shifted in the breeze. Every part of the chapel had been carefully considered to create not just an atmosphere of sight and sound, but of smell. On feast days, the scents grew even stronger. Imagine Christmas in a castle chapel. Pine boughs brought in to decorate filled the space with sharp, fresh fragrance. Herbs were scattered on the floors, releasing their aroma underfoot. Incense burned heavier, almost choking in its intensity, while the voices of chants rose above it. The smell of fasting foods like fish or vegetable stews drifted in from kitchens, mixing with the sacred scents, making a sensory tapestry that was both holy and homely at once. For ordinary castle dwellers, these smells were more than just pleasant. They were deeply tied to the rhythms of life. The scent of incense meant not just prayer, but community, gathering, ritual, and order. Children growing up in castles would have come to recognize the smell of beeswax as the scent of reverence, as much a marker of holiness as the priest's voice or the echo of organ pipes. But faith wasn't confined to chapels. Religious rituals spilled into other parts of the castle. On holy days, food was blessed, and the smell of herbs was used to sanctify spaces. Easter feasts might begin with the smell of freshly baked bread, sprinkled with holy water, sharp and herbal. Corpus Christi processions could fill courtyards with the smell of flowers strewn across paths, their fragrance crushed under feet as chants echoed above. Imagine standing in a courtyard on such a day, flower petals beneath your shoes, incense drifting from the chapel door, and the sun warming the air so that all scents blended into something joyous, almost overwhelming. Even personal devotion had its fragrance. Nobles sometimes carried prayer books scented with herbs, pressed between pages. Rosary beads, carved of wood or bone, absorbed the faint smell of hands, oils, or flowers rubbed into them. Pilgrims returning with relics often brought back small pouches of perfumed soil, frankincense, or holy oils. These carried scents that marked not just faith, but identity. To smell frankincense at a castle was to be reminded of the Holy Land, of pilgrimages, of distant mysteries. And yet, devotion was not always grand. Imagine a servant pausing at a tiny wall niche where a candle flickered beside a simple cross. The smell of that one beeswax candle, faint though it was, offered comfort after a long day. Or picture a knight kneeling in his chamber before riding out, his hands clutching a rosary, the faint smell of leather mixing with a sprig of rosemary tucked into his tunic for luck. These were small moments, scented not with grandeur, but with intimacy. Festivals also brought their share of earthly smells into sacred life. Fasting meant less meat, more fish, and the sour, briny smell of salted cod or herring became part of Lent. The air during these seasons was marked by restraint, by simpler foods, by incense heavier than meals. Easter reversed this. Suddenly, roasting meats and spiced cakes filled the air, mingling with incense in a way that must have felt dizzying, almost intoxicating after weeks of restraint. The smell of bells deserves mention too. While bells themselves had no fragrance, the act of ringing them often released the smell of hot metal struck against wood, the faint resinous tang of ropes treated with tar, the dust shaken from rafters. To stand near a bell tower was to breathe in all of that, along with the memory of sound itself vibrating through the chest. For many, those smells and sounds combined to mean safety, warning, or the marking of holy time, even death. When viewed through the lens of faith, smelled different in the chapel. Incense covered the scent of the body, candles purified the air, flowers and herbs spoke of hope. It was the same reality of mortality, but wrapped in the fragrance of ritual, transforming sorrow into something sacred. Faith gave castles not just order, but atmosphere. It infused the air with smells that spoke of something greater, something eternal. The resin of incense, the sweetness of beeswax, the sharpness of herbs, the freshness of pine or flowers on festivals, all of it created a sensory language that everyone understood. It said, "Here is holy ground. Here the ordinary smells of sweat and smoke fall away, replaced by the breath of heaven itself." But faith did not stand alone. Alongside the sacred were the everyday entertainments, music, games, and laughter that filled castles with their own fragrances and moods. What did it smell like when the minstrels played, when dice rolled, when laughter echoed down corridors? That is what we'll explore in the next part. From chapels filled with incense and beeswax, let us step sideways into a very different corner of castle life: leisure and entertainment. For while castles were built for defense and order, they were also spaces where people sought distraction from duty. Music, games, storytelling, and laughter all filled their halls, and with them came smells that were as much a part of the experience as the sights and sounds. Tonight, we'll wander into those gatherings, breathing in the sense of merriment, relaxation, and play. Imagine a minstrel entering the great hall. His lute hangs at his side, and as he begins to tune it, the air shifts. Wood warmed by touch releases its faint, resinous smell. Strings creak faintly as they're tightened, and the audience leans forward, their own presence adding a warmth to the space. The hall is not grandly perfumed at such times. Instead, the smell of humanity dominates. Wool cloaks drying near the fire, the faint musk of leather boots, the sweet sour tang of ale spilled hours earlier. And yet, all of it blends into a comforting atmosphere, like the background scent of a crowded theater today. Games of chance had their own olfactory world. Dice carved from bone carried a faint, dry scent of polished ivory. Cards, later in history, or game boards made of wood, gave off their own woody, resinous fragrance. Picture a group of nobles hunched over a table, A candle burning low, the wax dripping, the smell of smoke and beeswax mixing with the sharper aroma of spiced wine. Every throw of dice clattered into the air, but beneath the sound lay the smell of anticipation. Sweat on palms, breath tinged with drink, the faint tang of tension. Storytelling, too, was scented in its own way. When a bard or elder retold tales of ancient kings, the fire was often the centerpiece. Imagine logs cracking, resin popping, sending out bursts of piney smoke. The storyteller leans close, his cloak carrying the scent of travel, of dust, of leather, perhaps of horse sweat from long roads. Children gather nearby, their hair smelling faintly of straw mattresses and rushes. The air is heavy with smoke and warm bodies, but under it lies the sweetness of expectation, the comfort of knowing a tale is about to unfold. Even smaller entertainments carried their own aromas. Falconry, practiced in castle courtyards, brought with it the musky, almost wild smell of the birds, sharp talons gripping gloved hands that smelled of oiled leather. Hunting parties returning brought the smell of earth, of crushed leaves, of dogs panting, their fur damp with exertion. These were not elegant perfumes, but earthy reminders of a pastime, deeply tied to survival and prestige. Music itself seemed to carry smell. A pipe or flute, carved of wood, released a faint resinous scent when warmed by breath. Drums smelled of hide stretched tight, sometimes pungent, sometimes faintly sweet from the oils rubbed into them. Imagine standing in the great hall during a celebration, the air filled with the beat of drums, the stamping of boots, the musty smell of dozens dancing, the faint clink of jewelry bouncing against collars. Even joy had an odor, earthy and undeniable. Leisure in castles often blurred with eating and drinking. Games were rarely played without a jug of ale close at hand. The yeasty, sour-sweet smell of ale filled the air, spilled drops soaking into rushes already heavy with grease and herbs. Wine, sharp and fruity, gave off its own tang, sometimes cloying if spiced too heavily. Mead added a honey floral sweetness, sticky on fingers and lips. Imagine the smells of drink thickening as the evening wore on, mixing with laughter, with song, until the entire hall smelled of revelry itself. Even quieter pastimes had scent. Needlework done by women in upper chambers released the smell of wool, of dyes, sometimes sharp and mineral, sometimes vegetal. Beeswax used to smooth threads added its faint perfume. The chamber itself carried lavender or chamomile strewn in the rushes, so that the quiet act of stitching was always done against a background of herbal calm. Leisure was not only loud and public, it was also soft and scented in these intimate ways. Sometimes entertainments came from faraway lands. Jugglers and acrobats arrived, carrying the smell of travel, dust, sweat, leather, foreign spices clinging to their clothes. Exotic animals might appear, their musky scents both strange and fascinating. Imagine the shock of smelling a trained monkey, or even a bear, in a castle hall. To those who lived there, these scents were as much proof of wonder as the acts themselves. The atmosphere of leisure was not always pleasant to our modern sensibilities. Imagine 50 men crowded around a table, drinking heavily, the air filled with sour breath, unwashed wool, sticky ale, and smoke. But for them, this was joy, comfort, a chance to escape duty. Smell, sound, and sight fused together into memory. A man might forever associate the smell of beeswax and ale with the night he won or lost a fortune at dice, or the scent of pine logs with the songs sung to him by a traveling bard. Even outdoor leisure carried smell as memory. Archery practice left the air sharp with the scent of stretched bowstrings, the faint resin of wax rubbed along them, and the earthy scent of trampled grass. Tournaments, with their horses and armored men, filled the air with sweat, leather, and the metallic tang of weapons clashing. The smell of dust rising from hooves was almost as much a part of the spectacle as the cheering crowd. Imagine standing among villagers, noses filled with dust and sweat, and feeling exhilarated because the air itself smelled of contest. So leisure in castles was not sterile or perfumed. It was lived through scents: ale, sweat, leather, herbs, wood smoke, beeswax, and honey. It was the aroma of relief, of stolen hours when survival was not the only concern. To breathe those smells was to breathe joy, however earthy it may seem to us now. But what about the world beyond leisure, the myths, the superstitions, and the unseen forces that people believed lingered in the very air of castles? What did it smell like when fear of the supernatural took hold, when stories of ghosts and omens seemed almost tangible in the night? That is what we'll explore in the next part. If laughter and music filled castles with earthy warmth, then superstition and the unseen filled them with an entirely different atmosphere. For medieval people, the world was alive with spirits, omens, and invisible forces. Castles were not immune to these beliefs. In fact, their dark corridors, echoing chambers, and hidden passageways made them fertile ground for ghost stories and whispered fears. And just as feasts, battles, or prayers had their smells, so too did superstition. Tonight, we'll step softly through that shadowy realm, where the air itself seemed heavy with mystery. Don't imagine walking alone at night through a castle corridor. The torches are few, the shadows deep. The air is cold, but more than that, it feels still, as though it holds its breath. The smell is damp stone, mixed with smoke drifting faintly from a distant fire. But beneath it, your mind convinces you there is something else. A metallic tang, or the faint scent of mold, or even something sour, like breath exhaled by no one you can see. To medieval people, such sensations were signs, proof that spirits lingered in the air. Ghost stories abounded in castles. Old lords said to walk the battlements, women in white drifting through chapels, knights heard clanking through walls. And with each tale, there were smells described: the scent of roses suddenly filling a room where no flowers lay, or the sulphurous stink of demons where a candle had blown out. Imagine a servant waking at night, the air in her chamber suddenly sharp with an unfamiliar odor, and believing without doubt that she was in the presence of something beyond the living. Superstition wasn't only about ghosts. It was about protection, too. Herbs were scattered in doorways, not only for freshness, but to ward off spirits. The strong smell of garlic was thought to repel evil. Rosemary was burned, its sharp smoke driving away not just illness, but unwanted presences. Imagine a smoky haze drifting through a hall at night, the fragrance acrid and overwhelming, yet reassuring to those who believed it kept the devil at bay. Animals were part of this olfactory world as well. Cats, often kept to hunt mice, were sometimes feared for their association with witchcraft. Their musky scent in corners might unsettle some, a reminder of the uncanny. Dogs, with their keener senses, were thought to smell spirits before humans could. If a dog suddenly bristled and growled in an empty room, people swore they smelled something too. A coldness, a sharpness in the air that felt wrong. Superstition also clung to the smells of the natural world. Bats in attics left behind their sharp, acrid guano, which some took as a sign of unclean spirits. Owls nesting nearby carried the musky odor of feathers and prey, their presence seen as ominous. Thunderstorms, crashing over castles, brought with them the metallic scent of ozone. Medieval people often linked that sharp smell to divine wrath or the presence of angels and demons in battle overhead. Imagine standing in a tower during a storm, the air thick with the scent of rain and lightning, and believing you were witnessing a war between heaven and hell. Certain rooms in castles earned reputations for being haunted, and smell was part of it. A damp chamber where mildew never seemed to leave carried the constant sour smell of rot. People whispered that it was cursed, that no matter how much incense was burned, the foulness never left, because something dark lingered there. In another room, a faint floral scent might appear unexpectedly, and people would believe it was the spirit of a woman who had died there, reminding them of her presence with the perfume she once wore. Superstition found its way into medicine too. Amulets were carried with herbs like sage or rue, their sharp smells considered protective. People tucked these into clothing, believing that as long as they smelled the herb, they were safe. Imagine a soldier on the walls at night, the cold wind whipping around him, clutching a pouch that smelled sharply of sage, and drawing courage from it. Even ordinary smells took on eerie meanings at times. A sudden waft of roses in midwinter was thought miraculous or supernatural. A foul smell rising from a corner could be explained away as a spirit's passing. People lived so closely with scents that anything unusual stood out, demanding explanation. In a world without modern science, smell itself became evidence of the unseen. Candles and fire, meant to light the darkness, carried their own supernatural associations. The smell of a candle snuffed out was sharp, acrid, instantly noticeable. People might see it as a warning. A spirit had blown the flame. If a fire hissed and released a strange odor, it was said to be the devil walking past. Even the familiar smell of smoke, when it grew too thick or unexpected, could unsettle entire households. Superstition also thrived during certain times of the year. All Hallows' Eve, for instance, was marked with bonfires. The air filled with the pungent smell of burning wood and herbs, thought to keep spirits at bay. The stronger the smell, the stronger the protection. Yule, too, carried its own mystical sense. Evergreen boughs, spiced drinks, and the faint sulfur smell of fireworks or powders burned in ritual. These odors tied human senses to belief, making the unseen world feel present and real. And then there were dreams. Medieval people often believed smells followed them into their dreams, that the scent of incense could bring holy visions, while foul odors could cause nightmares. Imagine lying on a straw mattress, half asleep, the faint scent of garlic or rosemary lingering in the rushes, and dreaming of angels or demons. The connection between smell and spirit was so strong that even in sleep, it guided the imagination. We may smile now, used to scientific explanations for odors. We know mold smells because of spores, not curses. That roses can bloom late in warm seasons, not because of ghosts. Yet, the power of smell to make us believe is still with us. Think of how a sudden familiar fragrance can make you swear someone you love is nearby, even if they're not. Medieval superstition was simply this instinct magnified, built into their world of castles and corridors. So castles were not only filled with the tangible smells of smoke, sweat, and food, but also with the intangible perfumes of fear and belief. Smells became messages, signs from beyond, comfort or warning, depending on how they were read. The unseen world was as real to them as the stone beneath their feet. But superstition was not the only invisible influence. There was also the air of diplomacy, of politics, of nobles and guests gathered in negotiation. What did a castle smell like during tense councils, during banquets where alliances were made and broken? That is what we will explore in the next part. Now let us climb back into the upper halls, away from whispers of ghosts and superstitions, and step into another layer of castle life, the smell of politics. Castles were not only homes or fortresses. They were seats of power. Councils, negotiations, and diplomatic feasts shaped history within their stone walls. And while words and gestures may have been recorded in chronicles, the atmosphere, the smells that clung to those tense chambers, tell us just as much about what it felt like to be there. Tonight, we walk softly through those gatherings, where the air itself seemed to weigh with the burden of decisions. Imagine the council chamber. A long wooden table dominates the room, its surface scarred from years of use. The air is thick with the smell of wood polish. beeswax candles, and parchment. Inked pots stand ready, their metallic tongue sharp in the nose, mingled with the faintly bitter smell of oak gall ink. Quills, trimmed fresh, smell faintly of feather and dust. The room has an earthy undertone, the stone walls holding cool dampness even in summer. The floor rushes faint with herbs meant to freshen the air. Imagine a group of men seated there, cloaks pulled tight, each breath adding warmth, each voice adding tension. The smell of wool and leather wraps around the room, carrying the weight of authority. Diplomats and nobles brought their own layers of scent. Perfumes, when worn, were heavy and musky, designed to project wealth and sophistication. Oils of civet, musk, or ambergris were common among the highest ranks, their odors intense, almost animal, filling a room as strongly as the words being spoken. Imagine a chamber filled with these clashing perfumes, layered on top of the sharp smells of ink and the earthiness of stone. It could be overwhelming, like sitting inside a cloud of ambition itself. Food often played a role in diplomacy. Even during serious discussions, trays of bread, cheese, or spiced wine might be offered. The smell of warm bread softened the mood, while the sweet, cloying tongue of mulled wine with cloves and cinnamon reminded everyone that wealth was at hand. Yet these aromas mingled strangely with the sharpness of ink and sweat. A council chamber might smell of roasting chestnuts one moment, then of tension the next, the scents shifting with the moods of the conversation. And there was always the presence of fire. A hearth burned at one end, its smoke mingling with beeswax and herbs. Logs cracked, releasing pine resin into the air. The fire's smell was reassuring, yet it also served to highlight the silence between words. Imagine sitting at the table, watching flames dance, smelling the wood as voices rose and fell around you, and feeling how much the air itself seemed to record. Negotiations could stretch for hours. The longer they went, the heavier the air grew. Sweat accumulated under collars, the scent of nervous bodies unmistakable. Gloves removed left the smell of tanned leather hanging in the air. Wine spilled carelessly left sweet notes that quickly turned sour. The room became a kind of olfactory map of the meeting's progress. Fresh at the beginning, thick and stifling by the end. Now picture a banquet staged for diplomacy, a different but related atmosphere. The great hall is filled with roasting meats, spiced sauces, honeyed cakes, all chosen to impress. The smell is abundance itself, carefully curated to send a message of power. Guests seated at long tables smell the richness and know this household is wealthy, secure, and worth allying with. And yet, beneath the feast smells lurk the human ones. Sweat, damp wool, smoke. Reminders that even in moments of grandeur, the body was never far from the table. Subtle details mattered too. Nobles sometimes carried scented gloves or pomanders, small balls filled with cloves, cinnamon, or rose petals. These items were meant to protect from foul air, but they also served as political signals. To release the smell of rose water in a chamber was to remind others of refinement, of connections to distant trade routes. Imagine the faint sweetness of rose drifting across a council table, clashing with the sour tang of ale on another man's breath. Even smells were weapons in these silent battles of status. The courtyards and audience halls carried their own atmosphere. Visitors waiting for an audience brought the smell of travel. Horses, mud, sweat, damp cloaks. Guards stationed nearby gave off the scent of oiled armor and leather. The air buzzed with humanity long before the meeting began. When nobles finally entered, the scent of incense might be burned briefly to mark the occasion, overlaying the earthy smell of travelers with a sacred perfume, a way of saying, "This place is holy." This negotiation is not just business, but destiny. It is easy to imagine politics as dry and abstract, but in reality, it was visceral. To be in a council chamber was to smell ambition, fear, and wealth as much as to hear words of treaty or war. The smell of ink-stained fingers, of musky perfumes, of spiced wine, of nervous sweat, all of it told the story alongside the records written later. History was not only decided by parchment and seals, but by men leaning close across tables, breathing the same heavy air, carrying the weight of sense that bound them together in a single moment of choice. When agreements were reached, the smell of sealing wax filled the room, sharp, resinous, almost pine-like as it dripped onto parchment. The acrid scent of smoke from the candle lingered as a sign of finality. Imagine leaning close as the wax hardened, the smell sharp in your nose, and knowing that this small act sealed lives, lands, and futures. And afterward, when the chamber was empty, the air told its own story. The smell of spiced wine lingered faintly, mixed with the sharper scent of ink drying on documents. Beeswax from candles coated the room in sweetness. But beneath it all was the residue of sweat and wool, proof that people had gathered, argued, and decided. The stone absorbed it. The memory staying, even after the words were forgotten. Politics gave castles an atmosphere unlike any other part of life. It was serious, heavy, layered with odors both comforting and suffocating. To breathe that air was to breathe history in the making. But politics was not the only business of castles. They were also hubs of economy, places where markets bustled, coins clinked, and trade brought new scents through the gates. What did a castle smell like on market day, when goods from near and far filled its courtyards? That is where we'll wander in the next part. Now let us step outside the council chambers, away from the heavy air of ink and ambition, and walk into the courtyard on a market day. For castles were not only fortresses and homes for nobles, they were also beating hearts of trade. Merchants, peasants, and travelers passed through their gates carrying goods from near and far, and with them a kaleidoscope of smells that turned the stone courtyards into vibrant sensory theaters. Tonight, we'll wander through that bustling scene, taking in the fragrances of economy and livelihood that imagined the gates thrown open at dawn. The first smells are of livestock. Sheep bleat in pens, their wool smelling earthy, oily, faintly sour. Cows shift impatiently, giving off the warm, sweet smell of hay mixed with manure. Chickens flutter in baskets, releasing the dusty odor of feathers. Horses stamp on the cobblestones, sweat and leather filling the air. The courtyard is alive with animals, and their scents set the tone before any trade begins. Then there is the food. Bakers set up stalls with loaves still steaming from early morning ovens. The smell of bread is everywhere, nutty, yeasty, earthy, warm. Some loaves are coarse and dark, others lighter and scented faintly with honey. Beside them, cheesemakers display wheels of cheese that smell sharp, pungent, sometimes almost overwhelming. The air hums with dairy tang, softened by the sweet smell of butter churned fresh. Imagine walking past a stall, the scent of bread and cheese mingling until it feels like the very definition of comfort. Meat stalls add their own, more pungent notes. Salted pork hangs in slabs, the brine sharp and unmistakable. Fresh cuts are bloodier, carrying the iron tongue of butchery. Smoke from small fires used to cook samples drifts upward, filling the air with the savory scent of roasting fat. For some, these smells were mouth-watering. For others, overwhelming. But no one could ignore them. Fishermen bring baskets of their own trade. Eels wriggle in damp straw, carrying a muddy, riverine smell. Salted cod and herring give off a sharper, bringier aroma, their preservation both practical and potent. The smell of fish is strong enough to dominate whole corners of the courtyard, a reminder that this was both food and necessity, especially for fast days when meat was forbidden. And then come the exotic goods, carrying scents that feel almost like magic. A merchant lays out small pouches of cinnamon, cloves, pepper, and nutmeg. Their sharp, sweet, spicy fragrances cut through the heaviness of livestock and fish like sunlight through clouds. To smell cinnamon in a castle courtyard was to be transported to distant lands. To whispering markets in the east, imagine villagers leaning close, inhaling deeply, marveling at scents they might only experience once in a lifetime. Cloth stalls also carried their own olfactory signatures. Dyed wool gave off mineral and vegetal odors depending on the dye. Sharp alum, earthy woad, pungent madder. Fresh linen smelled grassy, almost sweet. Silk, rare and precious, carried the faint, clean scent of mulberry leaves from faraway lands. Imagine running your hands over the fabric, breathing in those faint but distinct fragrances, each thread carrying the memory of its origin. Markets were also places of craft. A blacksmith might set up a portable forge, the air filled with the acrid tang of hot iron and coal smoke. Leatherworkers sold boots and belts, the smell of oiled hides rich and animal-like. Carpenters brought wood shavings, their fragrance sharp, resinous, almost refreshing in contrast to the heavier smells nearby. Children sniffed honey cakes from pastry stalls, their golden sweetness sticky on fingers. Each step through the courtyard brought a new scent, layered on top of the last, until the air was a living mosaic of economy itself. Money had a smell too. Coins clinked as hands exchanged them, their metal carrying a faint, sharp scent that lingered on fingers. Purses made of leather gave off their musky odor, mingling with the metallic tongue of silver and copper. Imagine reaching into your pouch, smelling both the coins and the sweat of your own palm, and knowing your life's work was wrapped in that mixture. Crowds added their own fragrance. Peasants carried the smell of fields, sweat, earth, straw, and animals. Merchants wore perfumes or oils, faint traces of civet or rosewater clinging to their clothes. Children ran through the stalls, smelling of dust and breadcrumbs. Guards, stationed at corners, smelled of leather and metal. Together, the smell of humanity itself was as strong as any stall's offering. Not all smells were pleasant. Waste from animals often collected quickly, leaving sharp odors that competed with cinnamon and bread. Latrine pits near courtyards carried their own pungency, especially on warm days. Spilled ale turned sour quickly in the sun. For some, the market was exhilarating. For others, it was overwhelming, the sheer mixture of scents almost dizzying. But this mixture was the smell of life, of economy, of survival. To breathe the market air was to breathe in the entire world of the medieval castle, from the humblest peasant's goat to the richest noble's spice pouch. It was a reminder that behind the stone walls, the castle depended on the smells of trade, on the goods and people who passed through its gates. As the day wore on, the smells shifted. Bread grew stale, fish warmed in baskets, cheese sweated under the sun. Smoke from cooking fires thickened, turning the courtyard into a haze. By evening, the air smelled of exhaustion. Trampled straw, spilled beer, the faintly sour odor of goods packed up too late. Yet to those who had sold, traded, and bought, it was the smell of livelihood, of another day survived. And when the gates closed again, the courtyard emptied, but the stone walls held the memory of the day. Tomorrow they would carry faint echoes, the sour sweetness of spilled ale, the faint spice of cinnamon lingering in cracks, the earthy smell of straw pressed into the ground. For castles, markets were as important as battles or prayers. Their scents reminded everyone that power depended not only on armies, but on bread, on wool, on coins, on the simple, fragrant business of living. So markets filled castles with the smells of the world, local and foreign, sweet and foul, comforting and strange. And through them, people connected to one another, to their land, and to distant places they would never see. But what about when the day ended and the castle grew quiet once more? What was the final smell of night? The scent of rest, reflection, and the long silence after all the bustle. That is what we'll close with in the next and final part. And now we reach the close of our wandering. We have stepped into feasts and funerals, into kitchens and chapels, into storerooms, sick rooms, and battlefields. We have smelled bread rising, incense burning, armor oiled, and herbs scattered. We have followed the heavy odors of fear and the soft fragrances of love. But what, you might wonder, was the castle's final smell at the end of the day, when everything fell quiet and the stones themselves seemed to rest? Tonight, we'll close with that stillness, breathing it in slowly, gently, as though we too are settling down for sleep. Imagine the castle at night after a long day. The fires are dimmed, the last scraps of food cleared away. The laughter of the hall faded into memory. The air now carries only faint echoes. A thin thread of smoke drifts upward from the last glowing embers, carrying that woody, slightly sweet smell of fire gone quiet. The rushes underfoot smell faintly grassy still, though dulled by the weight of footsteps. In the corridors, the air is cool, heavy with stone, carrying only the faintest trace of damp. The animals in their stalls have grown quiet too. Horses breathe slowly, their warm scent filling the stable. Dogs curled at doorways give off that familiar, earthy warmth of fur and sleep. Even they have stopped noticing the smells, settling into the rhythm of rest dog in private chambers. People lie on straw mattresses, their blankets holding the scents of wool, smoke, and herbs. A faint whiff of lavender, chamomile, or rosemary might still rise from the rushes scattered earlier, like a ghost of the day's freshness. Candles are mostly out, leaving behind the faintly honeyed, waxy odor of wicks extinguished, smoke still curling in the air. Imagine lying there, pulling a blanket close, and smelling the faint sweetness of beeswax mixed with the must of stone. It is not unpleasant. It is simply the castle's lullaby. The kitchens have gone silent, their fires banked. The smell of roasted meat has faded, leaving behind the faint char of wood and the lingering sourness of spilled ale. Bread left cooling on wooden boards smells quiet now, earthy and flat, waiting for morning. The buttery, cheesy tongue that filled the hall earlier has softened into the stone, barely noticeable unless you stand very close. These were the smells that clung, the background hum of life within the walls dot in the chapels. The candles still flicker faintly, burning down low. The smell of incense lingers, resinous and spicy, almost stronger now that the space is quiet. It hangs in the still air like a reminder that even while people sleep, prayers remain. Imagine breathing in that faintly holy perfume as you drift into dreams, a soft anchor to peace. Even the outdoor air tells its own story. If you step onto the battlements, you smell the night itself. Cool stone radiating the day's heat, the faint smell of dew gathering on wood, the sharp tongue of the moat or river nearby. Perhaps there's a whiff of pine from forests, or the salty tongue of sea spray if the castle stood on a coast. The night air carries all these in whispers, softer and clearer than the day. Guards on the walls breathe deeply, stamping their feet, their cloaks smelling of damp wool, leather, and smoke. Even in vigilance, the castle exhales calm. And here lies something important. The smells of a castle at rest were not always grand, not always overwhelming. They were subtle, a patchwork quilt of faint smoke, quiet herbs, cool stone, and breathing bodies. They told the story of endurance. After all the chaos of feasts, battles, sickness, and markets, the castle's final perfume was one of persistence. It smelled like life refusing to stop, even in stillness. Now, step back in your imagination. Picture yourself walking slowly down a corridor lit by a single torch. Your footsteps echo. The air smells faintly of smoke, damp stone, and the grassiness of rushes underfoot. You pass sleeping chambers, where lavender and wool linger. You pass kitchens, where bread and ash wait for dawn. You pass the chapel, where incense holds steady. You pass the stables, where the warm breath of horses fogs the air. Each corner carries a note, but together they form harmony. This is the castle's final scent, not a single odor, but a chord of existence. And perhaps this is what makes castles so human. For behind the grandeur of towers and battlements, they were places of smells we all still know. Bread baking, smoke rising, wool warming, herbs crushed, sweat drying, wax melting, soil turning. Their world was not so different from ours. Only the combinations changed. History is often told in battles and dates, but life, real life, was lived in senses. It was lived in smells. As you drift tonight, imagine the castle settling too. Imagine its fires dimming, its stables quieting, its halls cooling, its chambers sighing. Imagine the smell of the night air mixing with the faint perfume of lavender, the must of stone, and the sweetness of beeswax. Breathe that in, slowly, as though you too are lying down inside those walls, sharing the air of centuries. And as you let sleep come closer, remember this. The world changes, but the need for comfort, memory, and ritual never does. We all carry smells as memory markers, whether it's the sweetness of a childhood kitchen, the smoky perfume of a campfire, or the sharp freshness of rain on stone. Medieval people were no different. Their castles smelled of survival, celebration, sorrow, and joy. Just as our homes do now. So as you drift off tonight, remember, beauty changes, survival changes, history changes, but the need to feel safe and to be seen never does. Castles remind us of this, not only in their stones, but in their air. If this brought you calm, subscribe so we can share another journey together. And share this with someone who thinks they'd survive a day in medieval times. Though after all we've smelled tonight, I suspect many of us might reconsider. Now, close your eyes. Breathe deeply. Let the castle fade, leaving only the quiet comfort of your own room, your own safe walls. The story is done. The air is still. Sleep well,